The warehouse smelled of rust and rain as Riley Cole moved through the darkness, her boots whispering against cracked concrete while her instincts screamed that something violent and unfinished had happened here. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a Navy SEAL on leave, a precision instrument of force trying to remember how to be human after 8 months of fire and sand. Beside her, a scarred German shepherd named Shadow tracked a 2-month-old scent of betrayal, his ears pinned forward in a warrior's focus. This wasn't a training exercise, it was a reckoning. Before we dive into the heart of this conspiracy, hit that subscribe button to join our community at State of Valor, where we honor the bonds that darkness can't bury. Comment below with the city you're watching from, I want to see how far this mission reaches. The air in the back of the Philadelphia Animal Shelter was thick with the smell of pine cleaner and desperation, but Riley Cole only had eyes for the kennel marked, special needs, staff only. Inside, a German shepherd sat with a spine as straight as a drill sergeant's, staring at the door with eyes that burned like embers. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He waited. He doesn't respond to anyone, a volunteer named Denise whispered, her clipboard trembling slightly. He won't eat unless hand-fed. He won't play. We think he's depressed because his handler died. The department was going to euthanize him for aggression, but we begged for more time. Riley didn't look at Denise. She crouched, bringing her eyes level with the dog's. He's not depressed, Riley said, her voice a low rasp that carried the weight of a dozen deployments. He's on standby. He's waiting for orders that haven't come yet. The dog shifted. His nose twitched, catching the scent of gunpowder and salt that never truly left a seal's skin. It was the silent language of operators, a mutual recognition of scars and shadows. As the dog tilted his head, the light caught a custom metal tag on his worn leather collar. Riley reached through the bars, her fingers brushing the cold steel. If you find me, someone still believes I matter. Riley's pulse hammered against her ribs. That wasn't a pet tag, it was a contingency plan, a breadcrumb left by a man who knew he was walking into a grave. Who was his handler? Riley demanded, standing up so abruptly Denise took a step back. Officer Matt Hale, Denise stammered, checking her notes. AK-9 veteran. They said he died in a training accident 2 months ago, an equipment malfunction during a live fire drill. Training accident? Riley's jaw tightened until it ached. You don't get traumatized from a drill when you're a Tier 1 animal. You get traumatized when you're betrayed. She pulled out her military ID and pressed it against the glass of the office window. I'm Lieutenant Commander Riley Cole. I'm adopting him. Right now. Ma'am, he's classified as dangerous. He's not dangerous, Riley snapped, her eyes flashing. He's a witness. Now open the cage. When the latch clicked, the dog didn't bolt. He walked out with a measured, tactical pace and sat at a perfect heel by Riley's left leg. The shelter staff went silent. Shadow hadn't moved for anyone in 6 weeks, but he knew exactly what Riley was, a handler who spoke the language of the mission. Let's go finish what he started, Riley whispered to the dog as they walked toward her truck. That night, Riley's apartment didn't feel like a home, it felt like a command center. She didn't offer Shadow treats or baby talk. She set up a tactical-grade bed in the corner and watched as the dog methodically cleared every room, checking windows and establishing escape routes just as she had done on her first night in every safe house from Kabul to Baghdad. Riley sat at her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys as she pulled up the public records for Matt Hale. 32 years old. 10 years on the force. A spotless record. And then, the accident. Shadow, come here, Riley called. The dog approached, his weight leaning against her leg, a gesture of partnership, not submission. Riley pulled up the animal control report from the night of the incident. They found you 3 miles away from the training site, Shadow. You were covered in ash and bleeding from defensive wounds. Why were you 3 miles away if it was just a malfunction? Shadow let out a low, mournful huff, his amber eyes fixed on the screen. Riley picked up her phone and dialed a number that didn't exist on any public registry. Marcus, it's Riley. I need a ghost file. Riley? You're supposed to be on leave, Marcus's voice crackled with digital distortion. Decompressing. Remember? I found a K-9 with a SEAL-style extraction message on his collar, Riley said, her voice dropping an octave. His handler is dead, and the official report smells like a cover-up. I need Matt Hale's internal comms logs from the Philadelphia PD. Now. You're going to get us both burned, Marcus sighed, but the sound of typing started immediately. Give me 24 hours. But Riley couldn't wait 24 hours. She looked at Shadow, who was now standing by the door, his body coiled like a spring. You know where it happened, don't you? The dog's tail thumped once, a heavy, deliberate sound. The report says the outskirts, but you were found at the waterfront, Riley muttered, overlaying the maps on her screen. The triangle points to the old industrial district. The warehouses no one visits. She grabbed her keys and her sidearm. As they stepped into the humid Philadelphia night, the air felt charged. This wasn't just a search for a dead cop's legacy. It was a hunt. They reached the warehouse district an hour later. Shadow's demeanor changed the moment they crossed the perimeter. He stayed low, his nose pressed to the concrete, tracking a ghost trail only he could see. He led her deeper into the labyrinth of rusted steel and shattered glass until they reached a central floor scarred by more than just time. Riley knelt, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She saw them, dozens of shell casings scattered like deadly confetti. She traced the bullet paths in the walls. This wasn't a drill, Shadow. This was a 360-degree ambush. He was fighting for his life right here. Shadow sat perfectly still beside a dark, faded stain on the floor. He didn't whine. He just looked at Riley, his eyes demanding justice. I see it, partner, Riley whispered, her hand trembling as she noticed something wedged between two heavy crates near the floorboards. She reached in, her fingers closing around a small, battered piece of plastic and glass. It was a body camera. Cracked, lens shattered, but the memory card slot was still sealed. He didn't just leave a message on your collar, did he? Riley looked at Shadow, her heart pounding in the silence of the warehouse. He left the truth. As she pocketed the card, a floorboard creaked behind them. Shadow didn't bark, he bared his teeth in a silent snarl, his body shielding Riley's flank. In the distance, the low hum of an approaching vehicle echoed through the empty streets. The hunters were returning to the scene of the crime, but they didn't know that this time, the dog wasn't alone. Riley stood frozen in the center of the warehouse, her thumb tracing the jagged edge of the body camera as the low rumble of the approaching engine grew louder, vibrating through the soles of her boots. Beside her, Shadow's body was a statue of coiled muscle, his lips drawn back to reveal teeth that had survived years of tactical warfare. This wasn't just a car passing by, the rhythm of the gear shifts told Riley it was a police-issue interceptor, driven with a predatory confidence that suggested the driver owned the night. Riley didn't hesitate, she grabbed Shadow's tactical collar and pulled him into the deep shadow of a rusted shipping container, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The headlights swept across the space where they had stood seconds ago, two long fingers of white light searching for ghosts in the dust. Riley's hand went to the grip of her sidearm, her training overriding the fear, her mind already calculating the angles of fire. She wasn't just a tourist in this tragedy anymore, she was a participant. The car doors slammed, three distinct thuds that echoed like gunshots in the cavernous space. I told you I saw a light in here, a man's voice rasped, cold and sharp, cutting through the silence. Riley felt Shadow's chest vibrate with a soundless growl, a vibration she felt more than heard, a warning that the enemy was within striking distance. It's probably just kids or some junkie, another voice replied, sounding bored but carrying an undercurrent of authority that Riley recognized from her own years in the chain of command. No one comes here. Not since the dog ran off and Hale stopped breathing. Riley's breath hitched in her throat as she realized who was standing just 20 feet away. These weren't just random intruders, they were the architects of Matt Hale's death. She looked down at Shadow, whose amber eyes were fixed on the gap between the crates, burning with a hatred so pure it felt electric. The dog knew these voices. He had heard them as his partner bled out on this very floor. Riley reached out, her fingers sinking into Shadow's thick fur, a silent promise that they wouldn't die here tonight. Check the perimeter, the first voice ordered. If anyone's in here, they don't leave. We're too close to the final shipment to have some witness poking around. The sound of crunching glass moved toward their hiding spot, slow and deliberate. Riley felt the air grow heavy, the tension pulling tight like a piano wire about to snap. She couldn't fight 3 armed men in the dark without risking Shadow, and she wouldn't lose another partner. Just as the beam of a flashlight began to bleed around the corner of the container, Shadow did something Riley didn't expect. He didn't attack, he nudged a heavy, discarded metal pipe with his nose, sending it clattering across the concrete in the opposite direction. The footsteps stopped instantly, then pivoted, racing toward the noise. Over there. Go, the voice shouted. Riley didn't wait for a second chance. She moved with the practiced silence of a seal, keeping low, her hand never leaving Shadow's neck as they slipped through a side exit she had catalogued moments before. They didn't stop until they reached her truck, the engine roaring to life as she tore away from the industrial district, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. We're okay, she breathed, though her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. We're okay, Shadow. Back at the apartment, the silence felt different, no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. Riley sat at her kitchen table, the body camera memory card plugged into her laptop with a makeshift adapter. Shadow sat beside her, his head resting on her knee, his gaze never leaving the screen. The files were corrupted, flickering with digital noise, but as the first video began to play, the room seemed to turn ice cold. The footage showed the very warehouse they had just escaped. Matt Hale's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady, but with an edge of desperation. I've documented the serial numbers, he whispered into the mic, they're using the K-9 transport vans to move the crates after hours. It's been happening for months. Shadow let out a soft whine, his ears flattening as his handler's voice filled the small room. Riley's heart ached for the dog, but she couldn't look away. Suddenly, the video erupted into chaos. Shouting, the heavy thud of boots, and then the familiar, authoritative voice she had heard in the warehouse just an hour ago. Give us the drive, Matt, the voice on the recording said, no longer sounding like a colleague, but a predator. You're a good cop. Don't be a dead 1 inch. I can't let this go, Matt replied, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. You're using the dogs. You're using our partners to arm the people we're supposed to be protecting. The screen flickered violently as the first shot was fired. Riley jumped, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched the camera tumble to the floor, capturing the blurred image of 3 men in uniform standing over Matt Hale. The last thing the camera recorded was Matt's bloodied face looking directly into the lens, followed by a final, desperate command. Shadow, run, he gasped, the sound of his lungs struggling for air tearing through Riley's soul. Find someone who matters. Riley slammed the laptop shut, the room plunging back into a suffocating silence. She looked at Shadow, who was staring at the closed lid with a look of profound, agonizing loss. The message on the collar wasn't just a plea for help, it was Matt Hale's final act of faith in his partner. He knew Shadow would survive, and he knew Shadow would find the right person to finish the job. "He trusted you," Riley whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt to pull the dog into a tight embrace. "And you found me." But the emotion was quickly replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. These men were still out there, they were still in uniform, and they were still smuggling weapons. Worse, they knew someone had been at the warehouse tonight. Riley's SEAL training took over, her mind mapping out the next steps with lethal precision. She couldn't go to the local authorities, the very people she needed to report this to were likely the ones pulling the triggers. She needed a bigger gun. She grabbed her phone and messaged Marcus again. "The card is real. It's worse than we thought. I need a secure line to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Now." The reply came seconds later. "Riley, get out of the apartment. They have access to the city's surveillance grid. If they saw your plates at the warehouse, they're already on their way." Riley's blood turned to fire. She looked at the door, then at the window. The faint sound of a siren began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. They weren't coming to protect her. She grabbed her go bag and Shadow's leash, her movements a blur of efficiency. "Shadow, tactical heel," she commanded, her voice like iron. The dog didn't hesitate. He stayed glued to her side as they moved toward the back fire escape, avoiding the main hallway. As they reached the alleyway below, a black SUV skidded to a halt in front of her building, 3 men in tactical gear storming the lobby. Riley didn't look back. She ducked into the shadows of a nearby parking garage, her mind already 3 steps ahead. "They think they're hunting a dog and a grieving woman," she thought, her eyes narrowing as she watched the SUV from the darkness. "They have no idea they just picked a fight with a Navy SEAL and the partner who never forgets." Riley checked the magazine of her sidearm, the mechanical click sounding like a promise in the quiet night. The mission had changed. It was no longer about investigation, it was about survival and the absolute, uncompromising destruction of the men who had betrayed the badge and the bond of the warrior. "Stay close, partner," she whispered to Shadow, whose ears were pinned back, his body a dark blur in the night. "The real fight starts now." Riley felt the cold bite of the night air as she pressed her back against the damp brick of the parking garage, Shadow's flank a warm, vibrating weight against her thigh. The black SUV's tires screeched on the asphalt just a block away, a sound that signaled the end of her life as a civilian and the beginning of a war she hadn't asked for. She didn't need to see their faces to know who was inside, the tactical precision of their movements screamed specialized units, the kind Matt Hale had died trying to protect from themselves. Riley reached into her go bag, her fingers brushing the cracked casing of the body camera, the only thing standing between these men and total immunity. She knew the city's surveillance grid was already being combed for her face, her plates, and the dog that shouldn't have survived. "We can't stay on the grid, Shadow," Riley whispered, her voice a sharp, low command that the dog met with an alert tilt of his head. She pulled her burner phone from a Faraday bag, the screen's glow the only light in the shadows. She dialed Marcus, not waiting for a greeting. "They're at my door, Marcus. They're using the department's tech to hunt us. I need a dead zone, somewhere the cameras don't reach and the GPS signals die." "Riley, you're playing with fire," Marcus's voice crackled, stripped of its usual sarcasm. "If they catch you with that footage, they won't just kill you, they'll make you disappear. Get to the old subway tunnels near the waterfront. The signal is garbage there, and the city forgot those maps existed in the 90s. Riley didn't say goodbye, she cut the line and dropped the phone, crushing it under the heel of her boot. She looked at Shadow, whose amber eyes were fixed on the street where the SUV was idling. "You remember that way, don't you?" The waterfront. That's where you went when the world ended. Shadow's tail thumped once, a heavy, rhythmic acknowledgement of a shared trauma. They moved through the labyrinth of alleys, Riley's hand resting lightly on the hilt of her knife, her senses tuned to the frequency of a hunt where she was the prey. Every siren in the distance felt like a closing net, every shadow a potential shooter. They reached the rusted gate of the abandoned subway entrance just as a spotlight swept the brickwork above them. Riley shoved Shadow through a gap in the fence and tumbled after him, the smell of damp earth and stale air swallowing them whole. As they descended into the darkness, the silence of the tunnels felt more dangerous than the noise of the street. Shadow's nose stayed to the ground, his low, focused posture telling Riley that they weren't the only ones who had used these tunnels recently. "What is it, boy?" Riley asked, her voice barely a breath. Shadow stopped, his hackles rising, a low vibration starting in his chest that wasn't a growl, but a warning. He pushed his nose against a heavy, rusted door that led to an old maintenance room. Riley drew her sidearm, her thumb clicking the safety off with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. She kicked the door open, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dust. Inside, the room wasn't empty. It was a cache. Crates marked with police evidence tape were stacked to the ceiling, but the contents weren't drugs or cash. Riley pried one open with the butt of her knife, her breath catching as she saw the gleam of high-grade tactical rifles, the kind that didn't belong on the streets of Philadelphia. This is it, Riley realized, the weight of the conspiracy finally hitting her. This wasn't just a few crooked cops. This is a supply line. And Matt found the hub. Suddenly, Shadow spun around, baring his teeth at the darkness of the tunnel they had just left. The sound of footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and numerous, vibrated through the concrete floor. They were trapped. Riley looked at the crates, then at the single, narrow ventilation shaft high on the wall. "Shadow, up," she commanded, pointing to a stack of crates that could serve as a ladder. The dog didn't hesitate, his paws scrabbling for purchase as he vaulted toward the opening. Riley followed, her muscles screaming as she hauled herself into the cramped, metal duct just as the maintenance room door was kicked off its hinges. "Search everything," a voice roared, the same authoritative voice from the body cam footage. "The dog's scent is fresh. They're here somewhere." Riley lay flat in the duct, her heart pounding against the cold metal, her hand covering Shadow's muzzle to keep his breathing silent. Through the slats of the vent, she watched as three men in tactical gear, men she recognized from the department's elite task force, began tearing the room apart. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his chin, stopped right below their hiding spot. "We should have killed that dog the first time," the man muttered, his eyes scanning the ceiling. "Now he's brought a seal into our kitchen. If the boss finds out we lost the body cam, it's over for all of us." "We don't lose," the leader replied, his voice a cold rasp. "We find them, we take the card, and we bury them in the same hole as Hale." Riley felt a cold, jagged anger solidify in her gut. These men had killed a good cop, tried to murder a loyal dog, and were now treating her city like a battlefield. She reached for a flashbang grenade in her kit, her mind already calculating the blast radius in the confined room. She wasn't just going to escape, she was going to leave a mark. "On my mark, Shadow," she whispered into the dog's ear. She pulled the pin and dropped the canister through the vent. The room erupted in a blinding white light and a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the tunnel. In the chaos and screams that followed, Riley kicked out the back of the duct and slid down into an adjacent service corridor, Shadow landing silently beside her. They didn't run away from the explosion, they ran deeper into the dark, toward the only person Riley knew who could help her broadcast the truth before the task force could shut her down forever. "We have to get to Marcus's server farm," Riley said, her voice tight with adrenaline. "It's the only way to upload the footage without them intercepting the signal." As they emerged from a manhole 3 blocks away, the city was crawling with police cruisers, their lights painting the buildings in frantic strokes of red and blue. Riley saw her own face on a digital billboard, wanted for the kidnapping of a police K-9 and the assault of an officer. The lies were already outrunning her. "They've turned the whole world against us, Shadow," Riley said, looking at the dog who stood ready at her side. Shadow let out a low, defiant bark, his eyes bright with a warrior's resolve. He didn't care about the billboards or the sirens. He cared about the mission. Riley checked the time. Marcus's facility was 5 miles away, and the streets were a gauntlet of enemies. She looked at the scarred dog and the cracked memory card in her hand. "Matt wanted someone who wouldn't give up," she whispered. "I hope he knew what he was asking for." They stepped into the light of the street, 2 shadows moving against a world of noise, ready to turn the hunters into the hunted. "Would you like me to continue the story?" The adrenaline was a cold, sharp blade in Riley's chest as she and Shadow navigated the back alleys of the city, their faces reflected in the red and blue glare of sirens that seemed to be closing in from every direction. The digital billboards overhead were a constant reminder that the hunters had turned the entire world into an eye, painting Riley as a kidnapper and a criminal to mask their own blood-stained hands. Shadow moved with a low, predatory grace, his ears swiveling to catch the click of a radio or the heavy fall of a boot before Riley even sensed the danger. Every time a cruiser drifted past an alley entrance, Riley pressed herself into the brickwork, her hand over Shadow's muzzle, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the cracked memory card in her pocket. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore, she was the only vessel for a dead man's truth, and the weight of it was beginning to crush her. "We're almost there, partner," Riley whispered, her voice rasping as they reached the perimeter of an old, nondescript data center on the edge of the district. This was Marcus's fortress, a windowless monolith of concrete and cooling fans where the city's digital ghosts went to be processed. She punched a high-security bypass code into the side entrance, a gift from Marcus years ago, and pulled Shadow inside just as a spotlight swept the pavement where they had been standing. The air inside was freezing, humming with the mechanical drone of thousands of servers, a sterile contrast to the humid chaos of the streets. Marcus didn't greet her with a smile, he was hunched over a glowing terminal, his face pale in the flickering blue light. "Riley, you're a walking cardiac arrest," he snapped, his fingers never stopping their frantic dance across the keys. "The FBI's public corruption unit is offline, somebody just pulled the plug on their regional server. You can't just email this, Riley. The moment you hit send, the department's cyber unit will intercept the packet and scrub it from the face of the earth." Riley pulled the memory card from her pocket and slammed it onto the desk. "Then we don't send it to the FBI. We broadcast it. Every news station, every social media platform, every police terminal in the state. If we can't go through the system, we break the system." Shadow let out a sharp, sudden bark, his hackles rising as he turned toward the reinforced steel door they had just entered. Riley didn't need a sensor to know what was happening. The low, rhythmic thud of a battering ram echoed through the concrete walls. They had tracked her bypass code. The task force wasn't just coming, they were bringing the house down. "Marcus, how long?" Riley demanded, drawing her sidearm and checking the magazine with a mechanical click that sounded like a death knell. 10 minutes to bypass the firewalls and trigger a multi-point burst," Marcus groaned, his forehead beaded with sweat. "But Riley, the moment I start the upload, they'll know exactly which server rack we're using. They'll cut the power to the whole block if they have to. Then make sure they don't get to the rack," Riley said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Shadow. The dog was already positioned by the door, his body a dark, coiled spring of muscle and memory. He wasn't the broken animal from the shelter anymore, he was a warrior who had found his mission. Riley grabbed a heavy equipment crate and shoved it against the door, her muscles screaming with the effort. The first blow of the ram shook the frame, dust raining down from the ceiling. "Hey!" a voice roared from the other side, the same cold, authoritative voice that had ordered Matt Hale's execution. "Commander Cole, give us the card and walk away. You're a SEAL, you know how this ends. Don't throw your life away for a dead cop and a flea bag." Riley felt a surge of white-hot rage that threatened to drown her tactical focus. "He wasn't just a cop," she screamed back, her voice echoing off the server racks. "He was your partner. You killed your own brother." The response was a volley of gunfire that chewed through the steel door, sparks flying as bullets ricocheted off the concrete. Riley dove behind a server rack, pulling Shadow down with her. "Marcus, talk to me." 60%. Marcus yelled over the roar of the guns. "They're trying to remote wipe my drive. I'm fighting them in the back end, but I need more time." The door groaned and finally gave way, the heavy crate sliding back as 3 men in tactical gear stormed the room, their weapon lights cutting through the dim blue haze. Riley didn't wait for them to find cover. She popped up from behind the rack and fired 2 rounds, catching the lead officer in the shoulder. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He launched himself through the air like a black blur, his jaws locking onto the arm of the second man before the officer could level his rifle. The room descended into a chaotic symphony of screams, snarls, and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. "Shadow, back!" Riley yelled as a flashbang canister skidded across the floor. She grabbed the dog's collar and hauled him behind a heavy cooling unit just as the world turned into a deafening roar of white light. Her ears were ringing, her vision swimming in fractals, but she felt the vibration of Marcus's hand hitting the enter key. "It's out!" Marcus screamed, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. "The upload is live. It's hitting the national feeds." "Riley, look." Across the room, the task force leader, the man with the scarred chin, froze, his hand going to his earpiece. His face went from predatory confidence to a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. On the wall of monitors behind Marcus, the grainy, flickering image of the body cam footage began to play in a loop. Matt Hale's voice filled the room, his accusation of gun smuggling echoing over the sound of the very men who had killed him. The leader looked at Riley, his eyes wild. He raised his weapon, but his hand was shaking. "You think this changes anything? We'll be out of the country before the first warrant is signed." "No, you won't," Riley said, her voice deathly calm as she stood up, her weapon leveled at his chest. "Because every cop in this city just saw you execute one of their own. You didn't just kill Matt Hale. You killed the only thing that kept you safe from the rest of us." Outside, the sound of sirens changed, no longer the coordinated approach of a hunt, but the chaotic, screaming arrival of dozens of different units. The task force leader turned toward the door, but he was met with a wall of blue uniforms, not his own men, but officers from across the city who had seen the footage on their dashboard terminals. Riley watched as the men who had haunted Shadow's nightmares were forced to their knees, their badges stripped and their hands cuffed with the very iron they had used to betray the law. She felt the tension leave her body in a sickening wave, her legs nearly giving out as she looked down at Shadow. The dog was standing by Marcus's desk, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the floor. "We did it," Riley whispered, her hand trembling as she rested it on Shadow's head. "He can rest now." But as the federal agents began to flood the room to secure the evidence, Marcus looked up from his screen, his expression shifting from triumph to a deep, unsettling dread. "Riley, wait. I was digging through the encrypted subfolders on that card while the upload was running. There's a second file. A hidden 1-inch. Riley felt a cold chill wash over her. "What is it?" Marcus turned the monitor toward her. It wasn't a video. It was a list of GPS coordinates and a series of dates for shipments that hadn't happened yet. The last set of coordinates was for a location only 6 miles away, and the timestamp was for tonight. Matt didn't just want to expose them, Riley. He knew where the main stockpile was being moved. He knew exactly where the head of the snake was hiding. Riley looked at Shadow, whose eyes were bright and focused, his body already turning toward the exit. The mission wasn't over. The truth was out, but the threat was still breathing. "Marcus, give me those coordinates," Riley said, her voice hardening back into the tone of a commander. "Shadow, let's go. We have one more stop to make." The tires of Riley's truck screamed against the wet pavement as she navigated the final stretch of the industrial wharf, the GPS coordinates Marcus provided flashing like a heartbeat on her dashboard. Beside her, Shadow was no longer just a passenger, he was a coiled spring of lethal intent, his gaze fixed on the looming silhouette of the Pier 47 gantry cranes. Riley felt the weight of her sidearm against her hip and the even heavier weight of Matt Hale's legacy in her soul. This wasn't just about exposing a few corrupt officers anymore, it was about cauterizing the wound they had ripped into the heart of the city. She knew the police sirens she had left behind at the data center were busy rounding up the foot soldiers, but the architect of this betrayal, the man who had signed off on the K-9 smuggling ring, was here, at the water's edge, preparing to vanish with the final shipment of untraceable hardware. "We're not waiting for backup, Shadow," Riley said, her voice dropping into the low, guttural tone of a mission commander. "By the time the feds coordinate a perimeter, he'll be on a boat halfway to international waters. This ends with us." Shadow let out a short, sharp huff of agreement, his ears pinning forward as they rolled to a stop behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. Riley killed the lights and stepped out into the humid air, the smell of salt and diesel fuel thick enough to taste. She didn't need to see the enemy to know they were there. The rhythmic thud of a crane loading a freighter and the low murmur of voices told her the clock was seconds away from midnight. She adjusted Shadow's tactical vest, checking the reinforced handle one last time. "Shadow, stealth. On me." They moved through the labyrinth of steel with the practiced silence of ghosts. Riley's mind was a tactical overlay, mapping out every crate and shadow, her instincts honed by a decade of SEAL operations screaming that they were walking into the lion's mouth. A sudden flash of a flashlight swept the area, and Riley pulled Shadow into the darkness behind a heavy generator. Two men walked past, their conversation light and dismissive, as if they weren't standing on the wreckage of lives they had destroyed. "The boss says we burn the rest of the manifests once the crane finishes," one of them said. "No paper trail, no problem." Hale was the only one who cared, and look where that got him. Riley felt a surge of white-hot rage that threatened to break her discipline, but she felt Shadow's cold nose press against her hand, a grounding touch that reminded her of the mission. She waited until they passed, then circled around the crane's base. At the center of the clearing stood a man Riley didn't recognize from the task force, a man in a suit, looking more like a CEO than a smuggler. He was the one Marcus had identified as the silent partner, the high-ranking official who had turned the police department into his private logistics firm. "Load the last crate," the man shouted over the wind. "I want this boat moving in 5 minutes." Riley didn't wait for 5 minutes. She stepped out of the shadows, her weapon leveled at the man's chest, her voice cutting through the noise like a gunshot. "The boat's staying at the dock. Hands in the air, now." The man spun around, his expression shifting from shock to a sneer as he saw Riley and the dog. "Lieutenant Commander Cole. I heard you were making a nuisance of yourself. You really should have stayed on leave." He didn't raise his hands, instead, he stepped back as 3 armed guards emerged from behind the shipping containers, their rifles raised. "Drop it, Riley," one of the guards yelled. "You're outnumbered." "Am I?" Riley countered, a grim smile touching her lips. "Shadow, work." She didn't fire at the guards. Instead, she shot the heavy chain holding a suspended cargo net of debris directly above them. The net collapsed in a roar of splintering wood and metal, forcing the guards to dive for cover. In that split second of chaos, Shadow launched himself. He wasn't just a dog, he was a tactical weapon, a blur of black fur and fury that bypassed the guards and went straight for the man in the suit. The man screamed as Shadow's weight slammed into him, pinning him against the cold steel of the crane. Riley moved with lethal efficiency, her sidearm barking as she suppressed the guards, forcing them to stay pinned behind the crates while she closed the distance. "It's over," she yelled. "The footage is live. Every news station in the country is playing your face right now. There's nowhere to run." The guards looked at each other, the bravado fading as the distant, unmistakable wail of 100 sirens began to converge on the pier. They dropped their weapons, realizing that the paycheck wasn't worth a life sentence for treason. Riley ignored them, her focus entirely on the man pinned under Shadow's paws. She walked up to him, her weapon never wavering. Shadow was growling, a deep, primal sound that vibrated through the man's chest, his teeth inches from the man's throat. "You killed a good man for a profit margin," Riley said, her voice deathly quiet. "You thought he was alone. You thought this dog was just an animal you could discard. You don't understand how the world works," the man gasped, his eyes wide with terror as Shadow shifted his weight. "There are people above me, people who won't let this stand." "Let them come," Riley replied, her eyes as cold as the Atlantic. "Because now they know that there are people like Matt Hale who will die for the truth, and people like me who will live to make sure it matters." She reached down and pulled a hidden folder from the man's jacket, the physical ledgers Matt Hale had died trying to find. As she stood back, the first wave of federal vehicles swarmed onto the pier, their spotlights turning the darkness into day. Riley didn't look at the agents or the cameras. She looked at Shadow, who finally stepped back from the man, his ears relaxing as he sat at attention by Riley's side. "Mission complete, partner," Riley whispered, her hand resting on the dog's scarred shoulder. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't known since she first walked into that shelter and saw a warrior waiting for a sign. They had finished what Matt Hale started, and in doing so, they had found a way back to the world for both of them. As the sun began to break over the horizon, painting the harbor in hues of gold and fire, Riley stood with her hand on Shadow's head, watching the men who had betrayed their city being led away in chains. She was no longer a weapon without a purpose or a soldier without a home. She was a guardian, and she had a partner who would never let her walk alone again. The truth was no longer buried in the shadows of a warehouse, it was written in the stars, a testament to the fact that honor is never truly lost as long as someone is willing to fight for it. Riley looked out at the water, took a deep breath of the salt air, and knew that the mission was finally, truly over. Valor is not found in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to let the darkness win. Shadow's tail wagged once, strong and confident, as they turned away from the pier and walked together toward a future they had earned with every drop of blood and every ounce of loyalty. The bond between warriors is a fortress that no betrayal can breach, and the truth is a light that no darkness can ever fully extinguish.